Soldiers Memorial Building Parts 1 and 2 told the stories of 6 Civil War soldiers memorialized in the stained glass windows upstairs. Part 3 presents the stories behind the other 3 stained glass windows. 2 were Civil War soldiers, and 1 was the only non-military person and the only woman memorialized there.
Captain James B. Perry, Company C, 5th New Hampshire Volunteers, killed at Fredericksburg, Virginia, December 13, 1862, presented by the Masonic Fraternity. James B. Perry was born in 1834 in Cabot, Vermont. He spent his early years in Vermont and then moved to Hanover, New Hampshire. He married Mary Fitch of Hanover, and their daughter Ida Eunice was born on March 31, 1858. James Perry was a farmer. James Perry enlisted as the captain of Company C in the 5th New Hampshire Volunteers on October 12, 1861, under Colonel Edward E. Cross. He was 27 years old. Also in Company C was Lieutenant Nathan Randlett. A week later, on October 18th, the local newspaper reported, Captain Perry and Lieutenant Randlett, with most of those who enlisted under them here, have been home for a few days past on furlough. They are all looking well and enjoy camp life finely. They left for Concord Thursday morning. Our readers will hear from them occasionally through our column. The 5th New Hampshire Volunteers fought in many major battles of the Civil War, including Antietam and Fredericksburg. Captain Perry was a Mason, and as a Mason, helped recover wounded Confederate officers who were also Masons. The 5th New Hampshire fought at Antietam on September 17, 1862. The day after the battle, the 5th New Hampshire formed the picket line along the edge of the cornfield where Richardson's division fought. The reserve was in one edge of the corn, and the pickets about middle way of the field, concealed in the corn, as the sharpshooters of the enemy fired on all who undertook to walk around the battlefield at that locality. Early in the morning, one of the wounded rebels, who laid just outside the pickets, called one of the New Hampshire men and handed him a little slip of paper, on which he had, evidently with great difficulty, succeeded in making some mystic signs in a circle with a bit of stick wet in blood. The soldier was begged to hand the paper to some Freemason as soon as possible, and he took it to Colonel E. Cross of his regiment. The colonel was a master Mason, but could not read the mystic token, it belonging to a higher degree. He therefore sent for Captain J. B. Perry of the 5th, who was a member of the 32nd degree of Freemasonry, and showed him the letter. Captain Perry at once said there was a brother Mason in great peril and must be rescued. Colonel Cross instantly sent for several brother Masons in the regiment, told the story, and in a few moments, brothers of the mystic tie were crawling stealthily through the corn to find the brother in distress. He was found, placed on a blanket, and at great risk drawn out of range of the rebel rifles, and then carried to the 5th New Hampshire Hospital. He proved to be First Lieutenant Eden of the Alabama Volunteers, badly wounded in the thigh and breast. A few hours, and he would have perished. Another Mason, a Georgia lieutenant colonel, was also found wounded and aided. As Robert Grandchamp explained in his biography of Edward E. Cross, there was often friction between Cross, Captain Perry, and other officers, which was brought to a head after President Lincoln replaced General George McClellan with Major General Ambrose Burnside. Grandchamp wrote, "For units like the 5th New Hampshire, who had trained under McClellan for a year and looked to him as the master of their cause, the news was a blow that many would never forget." On the night of November 8, 1862, the 5th spread out along a muddy road, with the officers barely trying to push their men along. Cross, who was still upset about the removal of McClellan, was outraged at the straggling and screamed, "Close out, you goddamn hounds! Your company officers are not worth a damn." Captains James Larkin and James Perry became enraged. The colonel was pushing his men harder than he should, and spoke aloud that they would no longer serve under Cross because of such harsh orders. The actions of Perry and Larkin, even if they were uttered under duress and in the heat of the moment, was a major turning point in Cross's relationship with his commissioned officers. For over a year, the commander and his subordinates had endured a tumultuous relationship, with the colonel's violent temper and quickness at jumping to conclusions often hindering what should have been a respectful relationship between officers. That officers reacted in the manner that they did was a shock to Cross, who was determined to make examples of them. Cross demanded the officers either apologize or face court-martial. Seeing nothing wrong with their actions, the two captains appeared before a military panel, who acquitted them of mutiny. Captain Perry was reinstated as commander of his company on the 10th of December, 1862. While Perry and Larkin underwent their ordeal with the colonel, the two officers, in coordination with others in the 5th who were slighted by Cross, began to draw up course-martial charges against him, but for unknown reasons, General Caldwell decided not to permit the charges against the colonel to proceed, allowing him to retain command of the 5th New Hampshire. Less than a week after being reinstated as captain of Company C, Captain Perry was killed at Fredericksburg. From A History of the 5th Regiment, New Hampshire Volunteers in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, by William Child. At the time of his death, he was a master of the Lodge of Masons connected with the regiment. The memory of the just is blessed. The following scene is described by an eyewitness and participant captain, then Lieutenant Janvrin W. Graves of the 5th. He says that he was wounded. He lay an unwilling witness of a most affecting scene. After taking this position, he saw Captain Murray shot dead. Then Corporal Davis, bearing the national colors, fell dead or mortally wounded. Then Captain Perry took the colors from Corporal Davis, only a few feet from where he was, and as the captain was passing Graves, he was shot and fell upon or across him as he lay. Then Graves took the colors and held them up with his left hand, the staff resting on the ground. Perry was then unconscious from the shock and loss of blood, having been wounded in the shoulder and upper portion of the chest. Lieutenant Graves forced stimulants into his mouth, turned him upon his back, and lowered his head. Soon the captain recovered consciousness, looked about wildly, saying, "Why don't they mind the watchword? They are firing on each other." Then, becoming unconscious, stimulants were again administered, and Perry again revived for a few minutes. He looked up, recognized Graves, called out, "Hello, Lieutenant, is this you? How goes the battle?" Graves replied, "I think it is going against us. The regiment is all cut to pieces. Captain Murray and Captain Moore are dead and lie just in the rear. Major Sturdivant, Lieutenants Little and Ballou are in front of us, all dead or mortally wounded. Colonel Cross and Adjutant Dodd are near us, and a score of more men, all severely and many mortally wounded." Then Captain Perry, evidently failing, said, "This is my last day. I cannot live, but I would like to have lived long enough to see the battle go in our favor." Becoming unconscious again, stimulants were administered, and the captain again rallied. He then said, "I did hope to go home and see my darling wife and child, but I cannot. If you live to get out of this, write them or tell them I died a true soldier with my face to the enemy, fighting for my country." Then he again became unconscious, but soon rallied a little. All this time it was evident that the end was near. The ashen face, the staring eyes, the panting for breath, the ominous death rattle, and the oozing blood all declared that the vital spark was expiring. Rallying once again, he left a message for the colonel and others. Then he breathed with still greater difficulty. Nature, urged by the brave warrior's will, made repeated efforts to arouse, but life was now rapidly ebbing. As he looked up, his eyes dull and glassy, he said, "Where is that dear old flag?" Graves said, "I have it here." "Then," said the patriot, Let me see it once more before I die." Taking it in his hands, he held it above his face for a brief instant and brought it down to his lips, kissed it, and died. He died kissing the emblem of the country for which he had given his life a willing sacrifice. The Granite State Free Press reported on the death of Captain Perry. The body of Captain J.B. Perry of the 5th New Hampshire Regiment, killed in the late Battle of Fredericksburg, arrived in town yesterday. The funeral will take place today from the Universalist Church in this village at 1:00 p.m., to be conducted by the Freemasons, of which fraternity he was a prominent member. Captain Perry is buried in the School Street Cemetery in Lebanon. The GAR post in Lebanon was named in his honor. James Perry's wife, Mary, lived until September 8, 1924, mostly in Vermont. Their daughter, Ida, lived first with Mary, and then, after Mary's death, lived with relatives. She never married, and she died on April 30th, 1945. In Memoriam, Nathan H. Randlett, 1838 to 1902, First Lieutenant, Company C, Captain, Company E, 5th Regiment, New Hampshire Volunteers. Wounded September 17, 1862 at Antietam, Maryland. Captain, Company F, 16th Regiment Veterans Reserve Corps. Discharged January 1, 1868. Presented by his children. Nathan H. Randlett is the only soldier memorialized in the Soldiers' Memorial Building windows who survived the Civil War. Nathan Hammond Randlett was born in Massachusetts in 1838. His family moved to New Hampshire, and 1860 census records show that Nathan was living in Lebanon with his parents. He was a farmer, as was his father. Nathan Randlett was recruited in Lebanon and enlisted as first lieutenant in the 5th New Hampshire, Company C, under Captain James B. Perry on October 12, 1861. He had been married for just 1 week. He was appointed captain of Company E on September 8, 1862. A little more than 1 week later, he was wounded in the left thigh at Antietam on September 17, 1862, and spent time in the Academy Hospital in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. He was discharged from the Army on March 2, 1863, as permanently disabled. But he then, in September 1863, joined the Veterans Reserve Corps as captain of Company C, 16th Regiment. The Veterans Reserve Corps was a special branch of the military that allowed men with debilitating injuries to continue their war effort in other ways. He was discharged on January 1, 1865. Nathan Randlett became a member of the GAR James B. Perry Post No. 13 in Lebanon. He served as provost marshal in Pennsylvania, and in 1866 traveled to Texas to be an agent of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, or Freedmen's Bureau, was a U.S. federal government agency begun in 1865 to aid freed slaves in the South after the Civil War. He served in the Freedmen's Bureau for 30 months, first in the Anderson County office beginning in April 1866, and then in the Grimes and Brazos County office in Bryan from February 1868. Agents in the Freedmen's Bureau faced many difficulties. They were looked upon with suspicion or hatred by many of the white landowners who saw the freed slaves as a threat and the agents as carpetbaggers. Their responsibility was to settle disputes, many concerning labor relations. By the time Nathan Randlett arrived at the Brazos County office in Bryan, trouble was brewing. Barry A. Crouch, in his book The Freedmen's Bureau and Black Texans, explains that in early 1868, race relations in Texas were very strained, partly due to the freedmen's interest in politics and the upcoming elections. Nathan Randlett often asked headquarters how he could protect the freedmen and white unionists with a limited contingent of troops. He had only 5 soldiers to assist him. Randlett requested mounted troops, but they were never sent. On July 15th, in the town of Milliken, a riot broke out, fueled by rumors. Stories about it were carried in many newspapers, including the New York Times. Andy Hall explains in his blog, Dead Confederates, that throughout June there were rumors that a black preacher, George Brooks, had organized a militia company for defense against threats from the Ku Klux Klan. Nathan Randlett had ordered that no armed group of any sort was allowed to operate in Brazos County. On July 15th, a free black man was killed, and one of George Brooks' lieutenants organized a group of armed black men to seize the white man suspected of the crime. The mayor of Milliken organized a posse of white men who confronted Brooks's men and killed some of them. The mayor of Milliken rode to the freedmen's settlement with his deputy and demanded that Brooks's men lay down their weapons. Brooks agreed to talk with local officials the next day. That night, the Brazos County Sheriff came down to Milliken by train with a posse of 150 men. It was rumored that Brooks' militia would attack. On the morning of the 16th, Nathan Randlett and the local officials went to the freedmen's settlement for a meeting with Brooks and found him and most of the residents gone. The whites took this as evidence of an upcoming attack. Another train came in with more white troops, and they fanned out looking for Brooks and his men. By the end of the next day, the riot was over, but race relations remained bitter. Reports indicated the deaths of up to 15 black men. George Brooks's body was found a week later. He had been lynched. One historian wrote that the much-feared confrontation between the races had taken place, with whites protected by the United States Army and blacks massacred. Nathan Randlett wrote that there was no just cause for the riot. He thought it was founded and based upon the excitement of the people and aggravated by foolish rumors afloat in the vicinity and in the press of the country. Randlett stayed in Milliken until October, when he resigned from the Freedmen's Bureau. The Randlett's daughter Isabel was born in Texas. The Randletts moved back to New Hampshire. In 1870, the Randletts were living in Lebanon, and Nathan was employed as a route agent. He was commissioned Captain Company G of the 3rd Regiment New Hampshire National Guard in 1878. He remained in the National Guard for a number of years. In 1889, Major Nathan Randlett attended the Washington Centenary in New York along with his National Guard regiment. The regiment had 300 men and 7 companies, and according to reports, all wore blue coat, trousers with white facings, and black helmets and belts with brass trimmings. Each regiment had an excellent drum and fife corps. In 1893, he was still living in Lebanon and was a lieutenant colonel of the regiment. The 1900 census shows that the Randletts, Nathan, Ellen, son Frederick George, 34, and daughter Isabel, 32, were living in Somerville, Massachusetts. Both Nathan and George were postal clerks. Nathan Randlett died in 1902, and his children paid for the stained glass window honoring their father in the Soldiers' Memorial Building. He and his family are buried in Glenwood Cemetery in Lebanon. Nathan Randlett's daughter Isabel never married. She lived in her later life with her brother George and his wife. George married Rena D. Parker, a teacher, in 1922. He was 57, and she was 43. (1834 to 1913). In loving memory of Mary Elizabeth Kimball, a charter member of the Soldiers' Aid Society. Mary Elizabeth Kimball is the only non-soldier and the only woman memorialized in the Soldiers' Memorial Building windows. Mary Elizabeth Kimball's grandfather was a lieutenant in the Revolutionary War. Reportedly, he had the first plow used in Plainfield, New Hampshire. He married 3 times, and Mary Elizabeth is descended from his 3rd wife. Mary's father, Robert, attended Dartmouth College and was a veteran of the War of 1812. After his father's death, he was financially well off, and in 1835 saw the handsome brick house, still unfinished, built by Lebanon blacksmith Alexander Grimes on the present School Street. He authorized a Mr. Lathrop to purchase it for him. He then completed it in elegant style. His land also included hayfields and an apple orchard. He had 2 children, Robert Byron and Mary Elizabeth Kimball, born in 1834 in Plainfield. Mary Kimball attended the Lebanon schools and Kimball Union Academy. She worked in the Soldiers' Aid Society to aid soldiers in the Civil War. She was a pioneer in the prevention of cruelty to animals, and in her later years, with Mr. Gilman Whipple to drive for her, together they ordered the first automobile in Lebanon. However, another was delivered before theirs. From Mary Elizabeth Kimball's obituary in the Granite State Free Press, August 18, 1913. A strong character and a long life. Miss Mary E. Kimball, daughter of Robert and Fanny Willis Kimball, was born in the adjoining town of Plainfield, but passed all her life after the period of infancy in the family homestead in Lebanon. She laid the foundation of her education in the district schools of Lebanon and at Kimball Union Academy, and continued all her life to read extensively, so that she was a woman whose general information, sound wisdom, and culture, together with a gift of eloquent and vigorous speech, made her a most interesting companion and valued advisor. While she was actively interested in the affairs of the nation and the town, her life and strength were devoted, first of all, to the care of her property and of those in her home who were, in a greater or less degree, dependent upon her. A devoted daughter and sister, a most solicitous guardian of the welfare of her adopted daughter, Miss Kimball's home life commands the admiration of all who knew her well. But her usefulness was by no means confined within the limits of her home. She had unusual mental force and executive ability which made it inevitable that she should be a power in any community. The first and the dearest public service of her life was during the Civil War, when she gladly labored, gave, and sacrificed herself for the soldiers at the front and their bereaved and anxious families at home. This was before she was 30, and from that time down to the very last weeks of her life, no one who had a cause whose justice she recognized ever appealed to Miss Kimball in vain. She was a pioneer in the work for the prevention of cruelty to animals and children before any societies for carrying on the work had been formed in this vicinity. Wounded soldiers, ill-treated and orphaned children, abused animals, the poor, the sick, and the suffering of every class all have known and blessed the strength of Miss Kimball's hand and mind and the generosity of her heart. A lifelong friend, speaking of her death, remarked that very few are permitted to see their purposes accomplished and their hopes fulfilled as she has done. For the last 30 years, her thought and affection had centered around the care and training of her adopted daughter, Anna, whose love and devotion made Miss Kimball's last years increasingly happy. In entrusting her daughter in marriage last October to the care of Dr. Eugene J. Grow, she felt that she was bringing her life's work to a successful culmination, and, to use her own words, this afforded her inexpressible comfort, thereby rendering the last months of her life especially full of happiness. Full of years and of honor, with her son-in-law and daughter by her side, she peacefully breathed her life away. She will be greatly missed, as men and women of such strong character always must be missed, and her memory will survive in the sincere respect of all who in any way came in contact with her, in the heartfelt gratitude and affection of the many whom her kindness has blessed, and in the tender and enduring love of those who were near and dear to her. The funeral was held in the house Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock, attended by the Reverend J.W. Barker of the Unitarian Church. Interment was in the family lot in the School Street Cemetery, which is so near that no carriages were used. Miss Kimball's horses were used for the hearse. The funeral was largely attended by friends and neighbors. The floral tributes were choice and numerous. Mary's adopted daughter, Anna Cunningham, was born in Lebanon on October 2, 1881. She married Eugene Julius Grow in Lebanon on October 30th, 1912. He had attended Lebanon High School and was a brilliant Dartmouth graduate in the class of 1894. Eugene became first a doctor, and a captain in the Medical Corps of the Navy, and eventually Assistant Surgeon General of the United States. They had 2 daughters, Mary Elizabeth, who was born in 1914, and Virginia Maxine, who was born in 1916. Anna Grow remodeled the Kimball property. Some of the buildings were moved to nearby locations. Part of the barn was moved across the street and built up as a house. The house that was the home of Mary Kimball's hostler was moved to the northwest corner of Elm and Kimball Street, and for a time was the home to Senator Norris Cotton.